The bridge gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, and Margaret Townsend felt the world tilt beneath her wagon wheels. She had crossed Sombra Crossing a dozen times in the 3 years she had written for the Prescott Sentinel, and she knew the old timbers groaned when the wind kicked up out of Skeleton Pass, but she had never heard them scream. One moment she was flicking the reins over her borrowed mare's back, hurrying to beat the gray sky rolling down from the Bradshaw Mountains, and the next the whole deck of planks buckled beneath her like a broken jaw, and the wagon dropped through splintering wood into the frozen wash below. She had time only to scream once before her body was flung clear of the seat, over the shattered railing, into open air above the rocky creek bed 20 feet down. Then a hand closed around her wrist like a manacle, and her fall stopped so hard it wrenched a cry from her throat. "I have got you," a man's voice said, low and rough with strain. "Do not look down, look at me." She looked up instead because she could not help it, and found herself staring into a face she did not recognize, weathered brown from sun and wind, a jaw dark with 3 days of stubble, eyes the pale gray-blue of a winter sky. He was lying flat on his stomach on the near bank where the bridge had not yet fallen away, one arm extended down into the gap, his other hand gripping a fence post someone had driven into the earth for exactly this kind of accident. His hat was gone, blown off somewhere, and his dark hair whipped across his forehead in the wind. "I said look at me," he repeated, "not down at the rocks. Give me your other hand." Margaret swung her free arm up and caught his forearm, felt the muscle there go rigid as he took her full weight, and for 3 long seconds she hung suspended over the wash, while the last of the bridge deck crashed down into the water below in a shower of splinters and ice. Then he was hauling her up and over the bank, and they both collapsed onto the frozen ground, her skirts tangled around her legs, his chest heaving against her shoulder where they had landed in a heap together. For a moment neither of them moved. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel his heart hammering just as hard where her hand had come to rest flat against his coat. "You are alive," he said, and there was something almost accusing in the way he said it, as though she had done something reckless simply by nearly dying in front of him. "I am aware," Margaret said, and pushed herself up onto her elbows, her breath coming in ragged clouds in the cold air. "Thanks to you, I did not catch your name." "Clyde Underwood." He sat back on his heels, studying her with those pale eyes, taking her measure the way a man might size up a horse he was not sure he trusted yet. "You are bleeding." She touched her forehead and her fingers came away red. She had not even felt it happen. "It is only a scratch." "It is not only a scratch, it is a gash, and you are going to need it tended before you catch a fever on top of everything else." He rose to his feet in one smooth motion and offered her his hand. "Where were you headed in such an all-fired hurry that you did not notice a bridge half fallen down?" Margaret ignored his hand and got up on her own, brushing dirt and splinters from her wool coat, though she swayed a little when she stood and had to steady herself against a fence post. "I was headed to Dry Wash Station. I have business there." Dry Wash Station is another 6 miles, and there is no way across this wash now except my ranch bridge, which is 2 miles upstream, and even that will not hold a wagon in this weather much longer. He glanced up at the sky, where the gray had thickened into a bruised purple along the western ridge. "There is a storm coming in behind that wind, ma'am, and it is not going to be a gentle one. You cannot make Dry Wash Station before dark, not on foot, not with that cut on your head. I have made harder trips than this. I do not doubt it, but you are not making this one, not today." He whistled once, sharp, and from the brush along the wash a big roan gelding came trotting up, saddled and patient, clearly trained to come when called. "My ranch is a mile that way. You will come with me, get that cut cleaned, and wait out the storm." Margaret Townsend had spent 3 years building a reputation in Prescott as a woman who did not need rescuing, who rode alone to mining camps and army forts and remote stage stations to chase down stories that respectable newspapermen would not touch. And she was not about to let one bridge collapse turn her into a damsel draped over some cowboy's saddle. "I appreciate what you did," she said, and meant it, because she was not a fool, and she knew good and well that without his hand on her wrist she would be lying broken among the rocks in that wash right now. "But I do not need you to solve the rest of my day for me, Mr. Underwood. I can walk to Dry Wash Station. In this." He gestured at the sky, where the first fat flakes of snow had begun to drift down, lazy and deceiving, the kind of snow that always came before the kind that killed. You would not make it 2 miles before the wind picked up enough to knock you flat. I have seen men who knew this country their whole lives freeze solid 100 yards from their own front door in a storm like the one coming. I am not going to stand here and watch you walk into that because you are too proud to accept a roof. It is not pride, it is independence, and there is a difference. She lifted her chin, aware that she probably looked a fright with blood on her face and her hair coming loose from its pins, and not caring in the slightest. "I have built a life out of not depending on men who think they know better than I do what is good for me, Mr. Underwood. I do not need your name or your roof or your rescue to keep on building it. I will manage." Something shifted in his expression then, not anger, more like the flicker of a man recalculating a bet he thought he understood. "I never said you could not manage, ma'am. I said you would freeze to death trying to prove it, and I am not partial to watching that happen to a woman I just pulled off a collapsing bridge, no offense meant to your independence." Despite herself, despite the throbbing cut on her forehead and the cold seeping into her boots, Margaret felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "None taken, I suppose. Good. Now get on the horse before this wind takes the choice away from both of us." She looked at the sky again, at the wash below churning with broken timber, at the gathering dark along the ridgeline that even her stubborn heart had to admit looked like trouble, and she made the only sensible decision available to her. "One night," she said, "until the storm breaks. Then I will be on my way to Dry Wash Station, with or without your bridge." "One night," Clyde agreed, though something in his eyes suggested he did not entirely believe her, and swung up into the saddle before reaching down to help her up behind him. The ride to the bar took a little more than 20 minutes, and by the time the low ranch house came into view through the thickening snow, Margaret's hands had gone numb where she gripped his coat, and she had stopped pretending to herself that she was not glad of the shelter. The house itself surprised her. She had expected a bachelor's shack, all rough boards and neglect, but the ranch house Clyde Underwood led her into was solid and well kept. A good stone fireplace already laid with wood, shelves of canned goods lining one wall, a woman's quilt folded neatly over the back of a chair that looked as though it had not been touched in some time. He noticed her looking at it. "My mother's," he said simply, before she could ask. "She passed 2 winters back. I keep meaning to put it away properly and never do." "I am sorry," Margaret said, and meant that too. "So am I." He set another log on the fire, coaxing the flames higher, then turned to look at her directly for the first time since they had come inside, and she saw him truly notice the blood still drying along her hairline, the way she had begun to shiver now that the adrenaline of the fall was wearing off. "Sit. I will get water heated and see to that cut before you catch your death from more than just cold." She sat, because her legs had begun to feel unreliable, and watched him work with the quiet efficiency of a man used to doing for himself, filling a kettle, setting it near the flame, gathering a clean cloth from a cupboard. He had strong hands, she noticed, scarred across the knuckles the way a man's hands got from years of rope burn and fence wire and hard weather, but gentle when he finally knelt in front of her chair and tilted her chin up to examine the cut properly. "This is going to sting," he warned her, and it did when he pressed the warm, damp cloth to the gash above her eyebrow, but she did not flinch, only watched his face while he worked, the careful concentration in it, the faint frown of a man taking a task seriously because he did not know how to do anything halfway. "You did this before," she said. "Tended a wound, I mean. Plenty of times." Cattle work does not leave much room for squeamishness. He wrung out the cloth in the basin and pink water swirled. "You are lucky. It is shallow. Will not even need stitching, though you are going to have a bruise there that will make you look like you lost a fight with a mule. How poetic. I am a rancher, not a poet. But there was warmth in his voice now, and when their eyes met, something passed between them that neither one of them had a name for yet, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of trusting a stranger. "Well," Margaret said, clearing her throat and looking away first, "since I am apparently going to be a guest in your home for the evening, Mr. Underwood, it seems only fair I tell you why I was fool enough to be crossing a half-rotten bridge in the first place." Clyde sat back on his heels, studying her. "I confess I have been curious. I write for the Prescott Sentinel. My name is Margaret Townsend, in case introductions matter to you as much as they seem to matter to my editor." She managed a small, tired smile. "I am investigating the ironclad mine at Blackwater Gulch. There have been deaths there, Mr. Underwood. More than the mine owner has reported to the territorial inspector, and more than seems reasonable even for hard rock mining. I was on my way to Dry Wash Station to meet a man who used to work there, a timberman named Otis Prout, who sent word through the stage driver that he had things to tell me he was afraid to put in a letter." Something changed in Clyde's face at the mention of the ironclad mine, a tightening around his eyes that had nothing to do with the fire's heat. "Silas Renshaw's mine. You know him. Everyone in this valley knows him." Clyde rose and moved to the window, looking out at the snow now falling in earnest, thick curtains of white swallowing the barn 30 yards off. 3 years back, when the drought had my herd down to a third what it should have been, I took a loan from Renshaw's bank in Prescott to see me through until the rains came back. Reasonable terms, or so I thought. Man came out here himself to shake my hand on it, told me he believed in helping honest ranchers weather hard times. His jaw worked. Then the note came due early, some clause I had not read closely enough, some trick of the paper I signed without a lawyer to check it, and he tried to take my water rights on Kenyatta Wash in place of the money I did not have. I fought him in territorial court for the better part of a year, nearly lost the ranch my father built. Only kept it because a judge in Prescott took pity on a man who could prove he had been cheated by fine print. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "That is not the only thing Silas Renshaw does with fine print, Mr. Underwood. I have spent 4 months gathering what I can about the ironclad mine, and the pattern is the same, over and over. Men sign contracts they do not fully understand, promising their wages against the company's store, against equipment costs, against housing. The debt never shrinks no matter how hard they work. And when they try to leave, they are told they cannot, not until the debt is paid, and the debt is never paid because the books are kept by men loyal to Renshaw and no one else is allowed to see them." "Debt peonage," Clyde said quietly. "I have heard the term. Did not think men still did that kind of thing so plainly, not in this territory, not with a federal law against it since before the war ended. They do it plainly when they believe no one respectable will ever ask questions loudly enough to matter." Margaret's hands had curled into fists in her lap without her noticing. "And there is worse than the debt, Mr. Underwood. The mine has had 4 deaths this year alone that I know of, cave-ins in shafts that should have been shored up properly, and a sickness among the men who work the lower levels that sounds like nothing so much as poisoned air, bad ventilation, corners cut to save money. Renshaw reports none of it honestly to the territorial mine inspector. I believe he pays that inspector to look the other way. Otis Prout worked those lower shafts for 2 years before he got out, and he wrote to me that he has proof, ledgers he copied by hand before he left, records that would show the truth if anyone in Prescott cared to see them." Outside, the wind had picked up to a low, constant howl, rattling the shutters, and Clyde crossed to check the latch on the door before turning back to her. "And you were going to meet this Otis Prout alone, on a road you did not know was falling apart, in weather that was already turning. I did not have the luxury of waiting for better weather. He sent word he was leaving the territory soon, headed for California, afraid Renshaw's men would find him if he stayed. Then it is a good thing you are not the sort of woman who waits around for someone else to fix her problems, Clyde said, and there was no mockery in it at all, only a kind of grudging respect that surprised her, because it sounds like nobody else was going to chase that story down for you. Margaret studied him in the firelight, this rancher who had pulled her off a collapsing bridge with his own 2 hands, and then listened to her explain a dangerous, half-formed investigation without once telling her she ought to leave it to men better suited to the work. It was not what she had expected from a cowboy in the middle of nowhere. "You believe me," she said, not quite a question. "I believe Renshaw is capable of exactly what you are describing. I lived through a small taste of it myself." He came back and sat across from her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him after his time near the door. "The question is what you mean to do about a rancher's loan gone bad next to what you are describing at that mine. Those are not the same size of trouble, Miss Townsend." "Margaret," she said, before she could stop herself, "if we are to be snowed in together for the evening, you may as well use my given name." Something in his expression softened, and for a moment the careful distance both of them had been keeping seemed to thin. "Margaret, then." "And you will call me Clyde." "Clyde," she repeated, and found she liked the sound of it more than she had expected to. The wind screamed against the shutters like something alive, and outside the window the world had disappeared entirely into white. By full dark the storm had become something Margaret had never witnessed in all her years traveling the territory. A howling, blinding wall of snow that made the windows shudder in their frames and turned the short walk from house to barn, which Clyde made once to check on the horses, into a genuine risk to his life. He came back in half-frozen, snow crusted thick on his coat and eyebrows, and Margaret found herself rising from her chair without thinking, taking the coat from his shoulders, fetching a blanket before he had even finished stamping the snow from his boots. "You did not need to do that," he said, though he did not sound unhappy about it. "I am aware I did not need to. I wanted to." She draped the blanket over his shoulders and stepped back before the moment could grow into something neither of them was prepared to name yet. "Are the horses well?" "Fed, watered, and about as content as horses get in weather like this. We are not going anywhere tonight, Margaret." "Nor tomorrow, most likely, from the look of that sky before I lost sight of it." He settled into the chair nearest the fire, still wrapped in the blanket, and something about the domestic simplicity of the scene, the fire crackling, the wind howling outside, the two of them sharing warmth against a storm neither could control, struck her as more intimate than anything she had experienced with a man in a very long time. "Then I suppose Otis Prout will simply have to wait for me a little longer," she said, trying to keep the worry from her voice and not entirely succeeding. "Or he will make his own way toward California before the storm breaks, if he is as frightened as you say, and you will have to find him through the letters he leaves behind, or find another way into that mine's books." Clyde's eyes found hers across the fire-lit room. "I do not say that to discourage you. I say it because a good investigator plans for more than one road to the truth, same as a good rancher plans for more than one water source." "You sound like you have given this some thought already, for a man who only heard about my investigation an hour past." "I have given plenty of thought to Silas Renshaw over 3 years, Margaret. I never had proof enough to do more than survive his teeth in court. You might be the first person I have met with the stomach to actually go after him properly." He paused, and something more vulnerable crept into his voice. "My father built this ranch with his own hands, came out here in '58 when the Apache Wars still made every mile of this valley a gamble, and I nearly lost it to a man who never once had to risk anything he could not afford to lose. I would like to see that man answer for what he does to people who cannot fight him in a courtroom." Margaret felt something in her chest ache at the raw honesty of it, the kind of vulnerability she rarely encountered in the men she interviewed, who so often puffed themselves up with bravado even when confessing weakness. Then perhaps this storm did not blow me off that bridge by accident so much as it blew me exactly where I needed to land. Clyde looked at her for a long moment, the firelight catching the pale color of his eyes, and something passed between them again, warmer this time, less careful. "Perhaps it did," he said quietly. They talked long into the night after that, while the storm raged outside and the fire burned low and had to be fed again and again. Margaret told him about her father, a printer in Ohio who had taught her to set type before she could properly write her own name, about the newspaperman in Prescott who had given her a chance nobody else would, because he needed someone willing to travel to places respectable reporters avoided. Clyde told her about his mother, who had kept the ranch's books better than most men could, and taught him that a debt of honor mattered more than a debt of money, about his father, who had died of a fever the same year the drought began, leaving Clyde to face Silas Renshaw's schemes alone at only 26 years of age. "How old are you now?" Margaret asked, curious despite herself. 29 this spring. And you? 26 this past autumn. She smiled a little. Close enough in years, I suppose, that neither of us can claim more wisdom than the other. I would not dream of claiming wisdom around a woman who tracks down mine fraud for a living, Clyde said, and the smile he gave her then was the first truly unguarded one she had seen from him, and it did something unexpected to her heart, warm and sudden and slightly alarming. Eventually, the fire burned low enough that Clyde insisted she take the single bedroom, over her protests, while he made a bed of blankets by the hearth. She lay awake a long while listening to the storm and the occasional shift of his weight on the floor beyond the door, thinking that she had come to this territory to build a life entirely her own, free of any man's protection or name, and had not expected that the first person to make her reconsider the shape of that life would be a rancher who had caught her out of the air like it was the easiest thing in the world. The storm did not break for 2 full days. Margaret had expected, on the first morning, to feel trapped by the enforced idleness of it, the kind of restlessness that came from being kept from her work by circumstances beyond her control. Instead, she found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Clyde that surprised her with how little friction it produced. She helped him with small chores that could be managed close to the house, mucking stalls in the barn during a brief lull in the wind, mending a torn horse blanket by the fire while he oiled tack, and told her stories about the ranch's early years. He, in turn, asked her real questions about her investigation, not the polite, dismissive questions men usually asked a woman reporter, but sharp, practical ones, about how she verified sources, how she planned to get Otis Pruitt's ledgers into the hands of someone with the authority to act on them, whether she trusted the territorial mine inspector at all or believed him fully bought by Renshaw. "I do not trust him," she admitted on the second afternoon, while outside the wind had finally begun to ease into something merely bitter rather than murderous. "I believe the only way to force real action is to publish enough proof that the territorial governor cannot ignore it, or to find a federal marshal willing to investigate debt peonage charges regardless of what the local inspector says. Renshaw has too many friends in Prescott for a quieter approach to work. Then you will need Pruitt's ledgers, and you will likely need more than one witness, because a newspaper story built on one frightened man's word will be easy for Renshaw to discredit." Clyde set down the bridle he had been mending and looked at her seriously. "I know men who worked that mine and quit rather than sign the debt contracts. Ranch hands who tried it a season and came back to honest cattle work instead. If you want more voices than Pruitt's, I can help you find them. You would do that, knowing what it might cost you if Renshaw decided to make trouble for you again. Margaret, the man already tried to take my water and my ranch once. I'm not afraid of what he might try a second time, not when I have a chance to help make certain he cannot do to other men what he tried to do to me." His jaw set in a way she was beginning to recognize as pure stubbornness, an echo of her own. "Besides, I told you already, I do not much care for watching people I have decided I like walk into danger without someone at their back. Decided you like, Margaret repeated, arching an eyebrow despite the flush of warmth the words brought to her cheeks. That is a bold claim after only 2 days, Mr. Underwood. I have never been a man who needed a long time to know his own mind, Clyde said simply, and did not look away from her, and Margaret found she did not want him to. By evening of the second day, the wind had died to almost nothing, and stars had begun to show through gaps in the retreating clouds. Clyde stood at the window a long while, studying the sky like a man reading a letter. "We will be able to travel by morning," he said at last. "The roads will be a misery, deep drifts in the low places, but passable if we go carefully. I will take you to Dry Wash Station myself, and if Otis Prout has not already fled for California, we will hear what he has to say together. You do not have to come with me the whole way. I know I do not have to." He turned from the window, and in the lamplight his expression was unexpectedly solemn. "Margaret, I meant what I said to you at the bridge. You do not need my name or my protection to build the life you are building. You have proven that plainly enough these 2 days, telling me about editors who doubted you and stories you chased down alone into places men warned you not to go. But wanting to stand beside you is not the same thing as thinking you cannot stand on your own. I would like to help you finish what you started, if you will let me, not because I doubt your capability, but because I believe in what you are trying to do, and because Silas Renshaw has been a thorn in this valley's side for too long already." Margaret studied him for a long moment. This man who had somehow, in the space of 2 snowbound days, become someone whose opinion mattered to her far more than it should have this early. "All right," she said finally. "Partners, then, in getting to the truth of the ironclad mine. Though I warn you, Clyde Underwood, I do not intend to let a man's help become a man's ownership of my work. My name goes on that story when it is written, mine alone, and I will not be pushed to the side of my own investigation because a rancher decided to lend a hand." "I would not dream of trying," Clyde said, and something in the warmth of his gaze told her he meant every word of it. They left the Bar U at first light, riding double on Clyde's roan through drifts that in places came up past the gelding's knees, the world around them scoured white and silent and beautiful in the way that only followed real danger. The bridge at Sombra Crossing, when they passed near enough to see it, was a wreck of shattered timber half buried in snow and ice, a stark reminder of how close Margaret had come to dying there only 2 days before. She felt Clyde's arm tighten slightly around her at the sight of it, an unconscious gesture that told her the memory troubled him too. "It was not an accident," Clyde said quietly as they rode past. "That bridge has needed repair for 2 years. The county keeps promising funds and never sending them, because the man who sits on the county road board also sits on Silas Renshaw's payroll. You think Renshaw let it rot on purpose? I think a man who profits from isolated mining camps has no interest in good roads that let outside eyes in. Whether he ordered it neglected or simply benefited from someone else's laziness, I could not say for certain, but I intend to ask before this is over." Dry Wash Station sat where the road forked toward Blackwater Gulch, a low adobe building with a corral and a well, run by an aging stage agent named Harmon Voss, who greeted Clyde by name and eyed Margaret with open curiosity. "You are the newspaper woman," Voss said, once introductions were made, wiping his hands on a rag stained with axle grease. "Otis Prout waited on you 2 days past, near drove himself to fretting when the storm came in and you did not show. Left just this morning, matter of fact, on the early stage toward Prescott, said he meant to catch the westbound rail connection from there toward California within the week." Margaret's heart sank. "Did he leave anything? A letter, papers, anything at all?" Voss hesitated, glancing toward Clyde as though seeking some unspoken permission, then reached beneath the station's counter and withdrew a thick, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. "Said if a woman matching your description came asking, and not before, I was to give you this. Made me swear on my mother's grave I would not hand it to anyone else, not even if they claimed to be sent by you." Margaret took the bundle with hands that were not quite steady and unwrapped it carefully on the station counter. Inside were pages of careful, cramped handwriting, columns of figures, names, dates, a record copied laboriously by a frightened man determined to leave a trail of truth behind him even as he fled the danger of speaking it aloud. "This is it," she breathed, scanning the first page, her reporter's eye already picking out details that confirmed everything she had suspected. Wage records against store debt going back 3 years. Names of men who died in the lower shafts, with causes listed here as accidents that do not match what I have heard from other sources. And here, her finger stopped on a column near the bottom of one page, payments, regular payments to a name I recognize. Amos Riggle, the territorial mine inspector. Clyde leaned over her shoulder to look, close enough that she was aware of his warmth, his focus utterly on the page rather than on her, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. That is proof enough to hang the man's reputation, if nothing else. Riggle taking bribes to falsify inspection reports is a federal matter, same as the debt peonage. It is proof enough to hang more than his reputation, if I can get it to the right eyes, Margaret said, already thinking ahead to the article forming in her mind, the way she would need to structure it, the corroborating witnesses Clyde had promised to help her find. But Renshaw will not simply let this stand once he learns Prout got it out. If he knows I have it, then we make certain he does not know until it is already published where he cannot bury it, Clyde said. Or we make certain that when he comes for it, he finds more resistance than he expects. Harmon Voss cleared his throat uncomfortably. I would not linger here long with those papers if I were you too. Renshaw has men who pass through this station regular enough, and word travels fast in this territory when there is money involved in keeping it quiet. They thanked Voss and rode on that same day toward Kenyatta Station, closer to Clyde's ranch, where Margaret intended to begin writing, while Clyde rode out to speak with the men he knew who had worked the ironclad mine and left it. It was there, 3 days later, that the first real threat arrived, and Margaret understood fully for the first time just how dangerous the story she was chasing had become. She had been alone at Kenyatta Station's small back room, which the station master's wife had let her use as a place to write, when 2 men rode up in the late afternoon, their horses lathered as though ridden hard and far. Margaret recognized neither of them, but something in the deliberate, unhurried way they dismounted set her nerves on edge before either of them said a word. "Miss Townsend," the taller of the two said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. He had a lean, hungry face and eyes the color of muddy water. "Name is Dell Hawkins. I work for Mr. Silas Renshaw. He would like a word with you, regarding a manuscript he believes you may have come into possession of, one that does not rightly belong to you." "I do not believe I have anything belonging to Mr. Renshaw," Margaret said, keeping her voice level despite the way her pulse had begun to race. She was alone, she realized, with Clyde still out visiting former mine workers along the wash, and the station master's wife had gone to fetch water from the well. "If Mr. Renshaw has a complaint, he is welcome to bring it to the Sentinel's offices in Prescott, where I would be glad to discuss it in the presence of my editor and a proper witness. Mr. Renshaw does not much care to conduct his business through newspapers," Hawkins said, taking a slow step closer, his companion drifting to circle wide, cutting off her path toward the door. "He would prefer those papers came directly to him, quiet and simple, and no need for anyone to get hurt over what is, after all, just some scribbling from a disgruntled former employee who never understood the true accounts." "If they are only scribbling from a disgruntled employee, Mr. Hawkins, I cannot imagine why Mr. Renshaw would send 2 men riding half a day to retrieve them." Something flickered across Hawkins's face, irritation at being outmaneuvered even in a simple exchange of words, and he took another step forward, his hand drifting toward his coat in a way that made Margaret's breath catch. "I would not test my patience further, Miss Townsend, if I were." The station door banged open, and Clyde Underwood stood in the frame, rifle already leveled, his expression colder than Margaret had yet seen it. Take another step toward her, Hawkins, and you will not need to worry about Renshaw's patience or mine, either one." Clyde's voice carried none of the warmth she had grown used to over the past days. It was flat, dangerous, a rancher's voice for dealing with wolves among the herd. "I know you. I know your work. You were the man who came to my ranch 3 years back to serve papers on my water rights, back when Renshaw still thought he could scare me off my own land." Hawkins's hand stopped its drift, and slowly, deliberately, he raised both palms into view. "Underwood. Did not expect to find you playing bodyguard to a newspaper woman. I am not playing at anything. Get on your horses, both of you, and ride back to Renshaw, and tell him that whatever proof he thinks he can scare out of Miss Townsend's hands, he is going to find it a good deal harder to take than he expects." Clyde's rifle did not waver. "And tell him I have not forgotten what he tried with my water, and I have even less patience now for watching him try the same tricks on someone else." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then Hawkins's companion, younger and clearly less committed to the confrontation, muttered something about not being paid enough for gunplay and began backing toward the horses. Hawkins held Clyde's gaze a moment longer, some silent calculation playing out behind his muddy eyes, before he too stepped back. "This is not finished," Hawkins said, swinging up into his saddle. "Mr. Renshaw does not forget people who cross him, Underwood, and he surely will not forget a newspaper woman poking around business that is not hers to poke into." "Tell him I look forward to whatever he tries next," Clyde said, and did not lower the rifle until both riders had disappeared down the road toward Blackwater Gulch. Only then did he turn to Margaret, and the coldness in his expression melted immediately into something closer to fear, the kind of fear a man felt only after danger had passed and he had time to imagine what might have happened instead. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I am fine," Margaret said, though her hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over, adrenaline draining out of her all at once. "You arrived just in time. How did you know?" "I did not know. I came back early because the wind picked up again, and I did not like the look of the sky, and I found their horse tracks on the road and did not like the look of those either." He crossed the room and, without quite seeming to decide to do it, pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly enough that she could feel his heart still hammering against her cheek. "I should not have left you here alone. I knew Renshaw would not simply let this go quietly, and I left you alone anyway. You could not have known they would come today, this soon." Margaret pulled back enough to look up at him, and found herself unexpectedly moved by the raw worry still written across his features. "Clyde, I have taken care of myself in dangerous places before. I do not fault you for not being at my side every moment. That is not the kind of partnership I want, one where you feel you must guard me every hour of the day. I know that is not what you want," he said quietly, "and I am trying to respect it. But Margaret, I am not made of stone. Watching Hawkins take even one step toward you put a fear in me I have not felt since the day my father died. I cannot promise not to worry for you. I can only promise not to let that worry become a cage around what you are trying to do." Something in his honesty disarmed her more thoroughly than any grand romantic gesture could have. She reached up and touched his jaw gently, feeling the tension there slowly ease beneath her fingers. "That is a fair promise," she said softly. "I think I can live with a man who worries for me, so long as he does not try to lock me away because of it." "I would not dare try to lock you away, Margaret Townsend. I do not believe there is a cage built that could hold you, and I would not want one built even if there were." His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with something neither had quite dared to name yet. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to step back if she wished, Clyde lowered his head and kissed her, and Margaret found she had no wish to step back at all. It was a gentle kiss at first, careful, as though he were still asking a question with his lips that his words had already asked and been answered. But when she leaned into it, her hand sliding up to rest against his chest, the kiss deepened into something with real hunger behind it, weeks of careful distance dissolving in the warmth of the station's back room while outside the wind picked up once more, promising another storm before nightfall. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, Clyde rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the moment I pulled you off that bridge," he admitted. "I suspected as much," Margaret said, smiling despite the danger still hanging over them both. "I confess I have wanted the same thing for at least as long, though I would have denied it under oath until about 30 seconds ago. Your secret is safe with me." His arms tightened around her once more, and for a little while the two of them simply stood together in the fading afternoon light, letting the fear of Hawkins's visit ease into something quieter, more certain. But the danger had not passed, only paused, and both of them knew it. 3 days later, the danger returned in a form neither of them had anticipated. Margaret had finished a rough draft of her article, working long hours by lamplight while Clyde rode out each day to gather corroborating statements from former ironclad workers, men who had left the mine, rather than sign away years of their lives to debt they could never repay. She had 5 separate accounts now, along with Otis Prute's copied ledgers, more than enough to force the territorial governor's hand, if she could only get the story published before Renshaw found a way to stop her. It was Clyde who brought the news that shattered the fragile sense of progress they had built. He returned to Kenyatta Station in the late afternoon, his face gray with something worse than exhaustion. "Jed Calloway is dead," he said without preamble, dismounting so quickly he nearly stumbled. "One of the men who agreed to give you a statement, found this morning at the bottom of a ravine near his cabin, his horse spooked and run off. The coroner in Blackwater Gulch is calling it an accident." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "You do not believe it was an accident? Jed Calloway rode that trail for 15 years. He knew every rock on it better than his own hand. And 2 days ago, when I visited him, he told me Del Hawkins had come by his place asking pointed questions about whether he had spoken to any newspaper women lately." Clyde's jaw was tight with barely controlled fury. "This is Renshaw's doing, Margaret, whether his hands are clean of the actual act or not. He is willing to kill to keep this buried." The weight of that settled over Margaret like a physical thing. She had chased dangerous stories before, had been threatened, had been dismissed and mocked and warned off by men who did not want the truth told, but she had never before had a source die because of information given to her. "This is my fault," she said quietly, sinking into a chair. "I asked these men to speak against a man who has already shown he will destroy anyone who threatens his profits. I put a target on Jed Calloway's back the moment I asked for his statement." "No." Clyde knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his voice fierce with conviction. "Margaret, listen to me. Renshaw put that target there the day he decided debt and silence were cheaper than paying honest wages for honest work. Jed Calloway chose to speak because he believed, same as you do, that the truth mattered more than his own safety. That was his choice, made with clear eyes, and you honor his memory best by finishing what he helped you start, not by burying the truth alongside him out of fear." Margaret looked up at him, tears she had not realized were falling tracking down her cheeks. "How do I know that is not simply what I want to believe, so that I do not have to carry the weight of what happened? You do not know it for certain. Neither do I, but I know Jed Calloway well enough to say he was not a man who did things he did not believe in, whatever the cost." Clyde brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch gentle despite the anger still simmering beneath his composed exterior. "And I know that if you stop now, if fear wins, then every man still trapped in those mine shafts stays trapped, and Silas Renshaw wins simply by being willing to spill more blood than his enemies are willing to risk. I do not believe that is the world either of us wants to live in." Margaret drew a steadying breath, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, feeling something harden inside her that was not quite anger and not quite grief but some determined mixture of both. "You are right. Of course you are right. But we cannot continue this slowly, gathering statements one careful visit at a time, while Renshaw picks off witnesses whenever he pleases. We need to force this into the open now, before he can silence anyone else. What did you have in mind? The territorial governor is traveling through Prescott next week, on his way to inspect the new courthouse construction. If I can get this story published in the Sentinel before he arrives, and get a copy of Pruitt's ledgers and my source's statements directly into his hands while he is in town, surrounded by witnesses of his own, Renshaw will not be able to simply make the problem disappear the way he has clearly been trying to do. Margaret's mind was already racing ahead, mapping out the logistics. But I will need to get to Prescott quickly, and safely, with everything Renshaw would kill to keep hidden. Then we go to Prescott, Clyde said simply. Together, and we do not take the main road where Hawkins and men like him will be watching for exactly this kind of move. There is a route through Skeleton Pass that is rougher going but far less traveled, and it will put us into Prescott from the north side, away from any of Renshaw's usual watching points. You know this country that well. My father hunted that pass for elk every autumn of my boyhood. I know it better than most men alive, and better than any of Renshaw's hired guns, unless he has found himself a native tracker I have not heard about. A grim determination had settled over Clyde's features, the look of a man who had decided a fight was worth having and did not intend to lose it. We leave at first light. The sooner we reach Prescott, the sooner this is out of our hands and into the light where Renshaw cannot bury it in another ravine. That night, neither of them slept much, both too aware of what the coming days might demand of them. Margaret spent hours by lamplight finishing her article, weaving together Pruitt's ledgers, the statements of 5 former miners, and now, with a heavy heart, an account of Jed Calloway's suspicious death, careful to write nothing she could not defend as fact, knowing that the credibility of every word would matter enormously once Renshaw's lawyers came looking for any excuse to dismiss the whole story as fabrication. Clyde, for his part, cleaned and loaded both his rifle and a spare pistol, checked and rechecked the tack on both horses, and packed enough provisions for a hard 2-day ride through mountain country still thick with the aftermath of the recent storm. When Margaret finally set down her pen near midnight, rubbing her aching eyes, she found him sitting near the banked fire, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You should sleep," she told him. "Tomorrow will demand everything either of us has to give." "I know. I find I am not much inclined toward sleep tonight." He patted the space on the bench beside him, and she came to sit, grateful for the warmth of him after the long hours of careful, exhausting writing. "Margaret, I need to say something to you before we ride into whatever is waiting for us tomorrow, and I would rather say it now, while there is still quiet enough to say it properly." Something in his tone made her heart quicken. "Say it then." "I have known you 11 days. He said it almost wonderingly, as though the number itself surprised him. 11 days, and in that time I have watched you face down threats that would send most men running, write the truth even when it costs someone their life, and refuse every single time to let fear make your decisions for you. I told you, that first day at the bridge, that I did not doubt you could manage on your own. I meant it then, and I mean it more now. But Margaret, I do not want to simply admire you from a respectful distance while you manage everything alone. I want to stand beside you, for as long as you will have me there, not because you need my protection, but because I have never in my life met anyone I would rather build something with." Margaret's breath caught, her earlier declaration at the bridge rising unbidden in her memory, the words she had thrown at him with such certainty on the day they met. "I do not need your name or your roof or your rescue to keep on building my life. I will manage. I still believe what I told you that first day," she said slowly, watching his face carefully as she spoke. "I do not need a man's name to give my life meaning, Clyde. I built the life I have out of my own stubbornness and my own choices, long before that bridge ever gave way beneath me, and I would go on building it whether you were in it or not." "I know that," he said, and there was no wound in his voice at her words, only understanding. "I would not want you to believe anything different or to want you for any reason other than exactly who you are." But, Margaret continued, reaching for his hand, threading her fingers through his, not needing something is not the same as not wanting it. I do not need you to build my life, Clyde Underwood. I find, rather inconveniently, given everything we still have ahead of us tomorrow, that I want you in it anyway. The smile that broke across his face then was unlike any she had seen from him before, unguarded and utterly bright, despite the exhaustion and danger of the day behind them and the greater danger still ahead. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then let us survive tomorrow," he said, "and worry about the rest of it after." "Agreed," Margaret whispered, and let herself lean into his shoulder, finding in the quiet warmth of that contact more comfort than she had known she needed. They left the bayou before dawn, riding 2 horses now instead of 1. Margaret's borrowed mare recovered from a neighboring rancher who owed Clyde a favor. The precious papers wrapped in oilcloth and secured deep in Margaret's saddlebag beneath a false bottom Clyde had fashioned the night before from a spare board and some careful stitching. A hiding place good enough to survive a casual search should they be stopped along the way. The route through Skeleton Pass proved every bit as difficult as Clyde had warned. Narrow trails still thick with drifted snow in the shadowed places, sharp switchbacks that demanded careful attention from both riders and horses. But it was beautiful too, in the stark way of high desert mountains after a storm, sunlight glittering off snow-draped pines, the world scrubbed clean and silent around them. For the first several hours, they saw no other travelers at all, and Margaret allowed herself to hope that Clyde's plan to avoid Renshaw's watchers had succeeded. That hope lasted until early afternoon, when they crested a ridge overlooking the pass's narrowest point, a natural gate between 2 rock formations that travelers called Widow's Gate, the last obstacle before the trail widened out into the gentler country leading down toward Prescott. And there, blocking the gate, sat 4 riders, Del Hawkins among them, along with 2 men Margaret did not recognize, and unmistakably a tall figure in a fine gray coat that looked entirely too clean and well-tailored for mountain travel, Silas Renshaw himself. Clyde reined in sharply, his hand dropping instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He came himself. He must be more worried than I expected. How did he know which route we would take? Margaret's heart was hammering. I do not know. Perhaps he simply had men watching every road out of the valley, and this was the one that reported in first. Clyde's expression had gone hard and calculating. Whatever the reason, we cannot get around them easily. The gate is the only passable way through here for 2 miles in either direction, and doubling back means losing most of a day we do not have if we want to reach Prescott before the governor moves on. Margaret looked at the men blocking their path, then at the sheer rock walls rising on either side of the narrow trail, and felt a cold certainty settle over her. Then I suppose we go through them instead of around. Margaret, I did not come this far, and did not watch a man die for speaking the truth to me, to turn back now because Silas Renshaw decided to put his own expensive boots in the mud for once. She straightened in her saddle, her chin lifting in the same stubborn gesture Clyde had come to recognize as pure Margaret Townsend. But I would welcome any strategy you have that involves fewer bullets than the direct approach seems to promise. Clyde studied the gate a long moment, his rancher's mind working through the terrain the way he might work through a problem with cattle and fencing. There is a narrow game trail above the main path, cuts along that rock face there, hard riding but passable. It would put us above and behind them if we could reach it without being seen, but Margaret, it is a dangerous climb, and if they spot us on it, there would be nowhere to take cover. How much time would it buy us? Perhaps enough to get past the gate while they are still repositioning to cut us off, if we are fast and fortunate in equal measure. Margaret looked once more at the men waiting below, at Renshaw's still, watchful figure among them, and made her decision. Then let us be fast and fortunate. They guided the horses carefully off the main trail, working their way up along the narrow game path Clyde had identified, both of them leaning low over their horses' necks as the trail hugged the rock face, loose stones skittering away beneath the horse's hooves into the drop below. Margaret's heart hammered with every unsteady step her mare took, but she kept her eyes fixed forward, trusting Clyde's lead, trusting the animal beneath her, refusing to let fear freeze her in place. They were perhaps 3/4 of the way along the game trail, close enough now to see the top of Renshaw's gray hat below them, when a shout went up from among the riders at the gate. They had been spotted. "Ride!" Clyde called back to her, and there was no more room for careful caution now, only speed. The horses scrambling along the narrow path as shots rang out below, wild and hurried, more meant to frighten than to hit given the awkward angle. Margaret felt her mare stumble once on loose scree, and her heart leapt into her throat. But the animal recovered its footing and surged forward again, following Clyde's lead down a steep, narrow cut that brought them back onto the main trail well past the gate itself, already through the bottleneck before Renshaw's men could reposition to block them. But Renshaw had not survived building a mining empire by being unprepared for setbacks. Even as Margaret and Clyde broke free onto the wider trail beyond the gate, she saw two of the riders wheeling their horses to give chase, while Hawkins and another man peeled off in a different direction entirely, no doubt intending to cut across country toward some point ahead where the trail narrowed again. "They mean to head us off further down," Clyde shouted over the pounding of hooves. "There is a stream crossing about 2 miles on, shallow enough to ford, but the banks are steep on the far side. If they beat us there—" "Then we do not let them beat us there," Margaret shouted back, and dug her heels into her mare's flanks, urging the animal to greater speed despite the treacherous, half-frozen footing of the trail. What followed was the most harrowing ride of Margaret Townsend's life, a desperate race through mountain country still scarred by winter, her borrowed mare straining beneath her, while behind them hooves thundered in pursuit, and somewhere ahead, unseen, Hawkins and his companion raced to cut them off. She had ridden hard before, had chased stories across dangerous country on more than one occasion, but never with quite this much riding on the outcome, never with the weight of Jed Calloway's death, and the truth of the ironclad mines suffering pressing so heavily against her chest. They reached the stream crossing perhaps a full minute ahead of Hawkins's flanking party, splashing through the icy water in a spray that soaked Margaret to the knee before her mare scrambled up the far bank, Clyde close behind her. The pursuing riders behind them had lost ground on the narrow trail, unable to match the pace on such treacherous footing, but Hawkins's group was closing from the side, close enough now that Margaret could see the grim determination on Hawkins's face. "Do not stop," Clyde called. "Once we clear this next ridge, the trail widens into the old Army road toward Prescott. If we can reach it before they cut the distance, we will have the advantage. There will be traffic on that road, freight wagons, other travelers. Witnesses Renshaw's men will not want watching whatever they mean to try." They pushed the horses hard up the ridge, and Margaret felt her mare's breath coming in great heaving gasps beneath her, felt her own lungs burning with the cold, thin air and the desperate exertion of the ride. Behind them a shot rang out closer now, and she heard the whine of the bullet pass entirely too near her head before it buried itself somewhere in the rocks ahead. "Clyde, I see them. Keep riding, we are almost to the ridge crest." They crested the ridge together, and below them, exactly as Clyde had promised, the old Army road stretched out wide and well-traveled, and upon it, blessedly, a freight wagon train of 6 heavy wagons made its slow way toward Prescott, teamsters and outriders numerous enough to make any further pursuit by Hawkins's men foolish in the extreme. Hawkins reined in at the ridge crest behind them, his companion beside him, both horses lathered and blown from the hard chase. For a long moment, Hawkins simply stared down at the freight train, at the impossibility of continuing his pursuit within sight of so many witnesses, his expression twisted with frustrated fury. "This is not finished, Underwood," he called across the distance between them. "Mr. Renshaw will find another way." "Then he had best find it quickly," Clyde called back, Because by tomorrow morning, every word he has done will be in front of the territorial governor himself, and no amount of hired guns will unwrite the truth once it is published. Hawkins held his gaze a moment longer, then wheeled his horse and rode back the way he had come, his companion following, both of them soon lost from sight among the rocks and pines of the pass. Margaret let out a breath she felt she had been holding for the better part of an hour, her whole body trembling now with the release of tension. "We made it. We are not to Prescott yet," Clyde said, though relief was plain in his voice too, "but we have cleared the worst of it, I think. Renshaw will not risk open violence on a road this well-traveled, not with his own reputation still something he cares about protecting, at least for now." They joined the freight train's slow procession for the remainder of the ride, grateful for the safety of numbers, and reached the outskirts of Prescott as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, both of them exhausted, saddle sore, and thoroughly relieved to see the town's familiar buildings rising ahead of them. The Prescott Sentinel's offices occupied a narrow brick building on Gurley Street, and Margaret's editor, a stout, perpetually ink-stained man named Amos Whitfield, very nearly fell out of his chair when she burst through the door with Clyde close behind her, both of them still travel-worn and wind-burned from the desperate ride. "Margaret Townsend, I had begun to fear you had gotten yourself killed out there," Whitfield exclaimed, rising so quickly he knocked over a stack of proof sheets. "The stage driver said something about a bridge collapse near Cañada Station, and then nothing for near 2 weeks. "I am well, Amos, and I have the story," Margaret said, already unwrapping the oilcloth bundle from her saddlebag and spreading its contents across his cluttered desk. "The ironclad mine, debt peonage, falsified inspection reports, and a man dead this past week for daring to speak the truth about it. I need this set in type tonight, Amos, and printed before the territorial governor departs Prescott, which by my understanding will be in 3 days' time." Whitfield's eyes widened as he scanned the pages Margaret laid before him, his journalist's instincts clearly warring with obvious fear at the scale of what she was proposing. "Margaret, if even half of this is provable, you understand what kind of enemy you are making. Silas Renshaw sits on the board of the Territorial Bank. He has friends in the legislature. He also has 4 dead men in his mind this year, and a debt scheme that violates federal law, Amos, and I have witness statements. Ledgers copied in a dead man's own hand before Jed Calloway was killed trying to help me expose it, and every fact in this article checked and rechecked against multiple sources." Margaret's voice did not waver. "I did not survive a bridge collapse and a chase through Skeleton Pass to have my own editor tell me the story is too dangerous to print, Amos Whitfield. Either this newspaper stands for something, or it does not." For a long moment, Whitfield stared at her, and then slowly, a grim smile spread across his ink-stained face. "You have always been the most stubborn reporter I have ever employed, Margaret, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Get me the final copy by midnight, and I will have this on the street by morning, and a copy delivered to the governor's hotel before he has finished his breakfast." The night that followed was a blur of frantic work, Margaret writing and rewriting by lamplight while Clyde helped Whitfield's typesetter arrange the type, an unfamiliar task he took to with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. By the time the first light of dawn touched the windows of the Sentinel's offices, the presses were running, the story of the ironclad mine's corruption pressed into ink and paper, ready to spread through Prescott and beyond, ready to reach the eyes of a governor who could not, once the facts were made public, continue to look away. But even as the presses ran, Margaret knew, and Clyde knew beside her, that Silas Renshaw would not simply accept defeat quietly. The final confrontation, whatever shape it would take, was still ahead of them. It came 2 days later at Sombra Crossing, of all places, where their story together had begun. The newspaper article had spread through Prescott like wildfire, copies passed hand to hand, discussed in saloons and shops and the offices of the territorial government alike. The governor, presented with Margaret's evidence directly by her own hand at his hotel, had promised a full federal investigation into both the debt peonage allegations and the corruption of the territorial mine inspector, whose bribery, once exposed in black and white in Pruitt's careful ledgers, could not be easily dismissed or hidden. But an investigation took time, and Silas Renshaw, cornered and desperate, chose in the interim to make one final, reckless attempt to salvage what he could of his position, and to punish those who had exposed him. Word reached the Bar U on a cold, clear morning that Renshaw, along with a dozen armed men including Del Hawkins, had ridden out from Blackwater Gulch and were making for Kenyatta Wash, where the county, shamed into action by the newspaper stories' revelations about neglected roads that served Renshaw's isolation of the mining camp, had finally begun rebuilding the bridge at Sombra Crossing. A crew of workers, along with a contingent of curious townsfolk who had come to watch the historic bridge's reconstruction, stood directly in Renshaw's path, and by the reports reaching the ranch, he intended to burn the half-finished structure rather than allow the road to Blackwater Gulch to become the open, well-traveled route that would end his isolated control over the camp and its miners once and for all. "He has lost all reason," Clyde said grimly, already saddling his horse when the news arrived by way of a breathless rider from Kenyatta Station. "Burning a public works project in front of witnesses, that is not a man being careful, that is a man being cornered." "Cornered men are the most dangerous kind," Margaret said, already reaching for her own coat. "I am coming with you." "Margaret, this is not a negotiation. There are a dozen armed men riding with him. And there will be witnesses there, Clyde, townsfolk, workers, the very sort of people whose opinion Renshaw has spent years trying to control through fear and isolation. If we let him burn that bridge unopposed, unwitnessed by anyone willing to speak of it clearly, he will simply claim it was an accident, same as he claimed Jed Calloway's death was an accident, and the story will fade before the federal investigators ever arrive to see the truth of what kind of man he really is." Margaret's eyes were fierce with the same determination that had carried her through every danger of the past 2 weeks. "This is the moment, Clyde. This is where the truth either wins publicly, in front of everyone, or gets buried by fear one final time. I did not come this far to hide at the ranch while that happens." Clyde looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him weigh his fear for her safety against his understanding of exactly who she was and what she needed to do, and finally, slowly, he nodded. "Then we ride together. But Margaret, promise me you will stay behind the wagons if shooting starts." "I cannot promise Renshaw's men will show the same restraint they showed at Widow's Gate, not when he has this much to lose." "I promise to be sensible," Margaret said, which was not quite the same promise he had asked for, but it was the most he was going to get, and they both knew it. They reached Sombra Crossing to find the scene already tense, the bridge's new timber framework half raised over the wash, a dozen workers and perhaps twice that many curious townsfolk gathered on the near bank, watching with growing alarm as Silas Renshaw and his armed men approached from the Blackwater Gulch side, torches already lit despite the bright morning sun, their intent unmistakable. "This bridge is being built without proper county authority," Renshaw called out as he reined in his horse at the wash's edge, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "I have interests in this valley that require its safety be properly considered before construction proceeds. I am ordering this work halted." "You have no authority over county road construction, Mr. Renshaw," called out the county surveyor overseeing the work, a nervous but determined man named Elias Coram. "This project was approved by the board 3 weeks past." Before, he hesitated, glancing toward where Margaret and Clyde had just arrived, clearly aware of the newspaper story that had prompted the sudden urgency behind the board's approval. "Before certain matters came to light that made a safe, well-maintained road to Blackwater Gulch a public necessity rather than a mere convenience." Renshaw's face darkened and Margaret saw, for the first time, the mask of respectability crack entirely, revealing the ruthless man beneath. That newspaper story was a pack of lies fed to a foolish woman by disgruntled malcontents who could not manage honest work. The story was true, Mr. Renshaw, every word of it, and you know it as well as I do, Margaret called out, urging her mare forward until she stood in clear view of the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Jed Calloway died because he dared tell the truth about your mind's ledgers. Otis Prout fled the territory in fear of his life for the same reason. And Amos Riggle, your bribed inspector, has already been arrested by federal marshals in Prescott this very morning, and has begun, I am told, to speak quite freely about the payments he received from you in exchange for falsified safety reports. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd at this news, townsfolk turning to look at each other, at Renshaw, at the torches still burning in the hands of his men, and Margaret saw something shift in the gathered onlookers. A townsfolk who had perhaps been willing to look away from Renshaw's reputation before now confronted directly with the reality of what he had done. Lies, Renshaw said again, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. This woman is a hired agitator, paid by my competitors to destroy an honest business. I have never in my life taken payment to write anything but the truth as I found it, Mr. Renshaw, and I will testify to that under oath before any court in this territory. Margaret's voice rang out clear across the gathered crowd. You built your fortune on the backs of men trapped by debt they could never escape, in shafts you knew were unsafe, and you tried to silence anyone who dared speak against it, including trying to kill me on the road to Prescott not 3 days past. There are witnesses to that as well, Mr. Renshaw, men who saw your hired guns chase 2 riders through Skeleton Pass with gunfire. Clyde had moved his horse up beside Margaret's now, his rifle resting across his saddle, not raised in threat but plainly visible, a silent statement of readiness that was not lost on Renshaw's men. You, Renshaw said, seeing Clyde clearly for the first time, recognition and fresh fury crossing his face. Underwood, I should have finished what I started with your ranch 3 years ago. You tried and you failed, same as you are failing now, Clyde said, his voice steady and hard. Look around you, Renshaw. These are your neighbors, men and women from Prescott and Kenyatta Station and Blackwater Gulch itself, watching you threaten to burn a public bridge because you cannot bear the thought of an open road bringing scrutiny to your mind. Whatever fear kept them silent before, I do not believe it will hold much longer, not with federal marshals already making arrests in Prescott this very day. The tension stretched taut across the crossing, Renshaw's men glancing uncertainly among themselves, several of the torches beginning to lower as their bearers looked to the surrounding crowd, to the surveyor quorum standing his ground despite his obvious fear, to the sheer number of witnesses now present to whatever violence might follow. Del Hawkins, Margaret noted, had gone very still, his eyes flicking between Renshaw and the gathered crowd, calculating, clearly no longer certain his employer's cause was worth the risk of a hanging offense committed in front of so many onlookers. Mr. Renshaw, Hawkins said quietly, the marshals already have Riggle. If we burn this bridge in front of all these people, in front of the county surveyor himself, there will be no talking our way clear of it, not this time. For a long, taut moment, Silas Renshaw sat his horse at the edge of Sombra Crossing, torches still burning around him, his empire crumbling visibly before the eyes of the very community he had spent years isolating and controlling through fear and false respectability. Margaret watched the calculation play out across his face, watched him weigh his remaining options and find them wanting. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised a hand, and one by one the torches around him were lowered, extinguished in the snow at the men's feet. This is not over, Renshaw said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, though even as he said it, the words carried the hollow ring of a man who knew otherwise. I have lawyers' connections. You have a great many federal charges coming your way, Mr. Renshaw, and I suspect your connections will find themselves considerably less loyal once the full extent of what you have done becomes public record," Margaret said, and there was no triumph in her voice, only a tired, clear-eyed certainty. "I would suggest you save whatever remains of your dignity by not resisting the marshals when they come for you, which by my understanding will be very soon indeed." Renshaw stared at her a long moment, hatred plain in his eyes, but he said nothing more. He wheeled his horse and rode back toward Blackwater Gulch, his remaining men following raggedly behind him, Del Hawkins lingering a moment longer to give Clyde a long, unreadable look before he too turned and rode away, leaving the bridge and the gathered crowd, and Margaret and Clyde standing together in the winter sunlight, victorious and entirely spent. The crowd erupted into a mixture of relieved chatter and applause, and Elias Coram crossed to shake Margaret's hand vigorously, thanking her for the story that had, in his words, finally given the county board the courage to fund the road repairs it should have approved years before. But Margaret barely heard him, her attention fixed on Clyde, who had dismounted and was watching her with an expression of such open, unguarded pride that it took her breath away more thoroughly than the entire dangerous confrontation had managed to do. "You did that," Clyde said quietly, once the immediate press of well-wishers had thinned enough to allow a private word. "You stood in front of a dozen armed men and told the truth until it could not be denied anymore." "We did that," Margaret corrected him gently. "I could not have gotten those papers to Prescott without you, Clyde. I could not have survived Skeleton Pass without you. This was never a story I finished alone, whatever byline goes on the article." "Perhaps not," he said, "but you were the one willing to chase it in the first place, when an easier woman would have stayed home and let men like Renshaw go on doing as they pleased." He reached out and gently tucked a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek. "I meant what I said to you, Margaret Townsend, that night before we rode for Prescott. I do not want to simply admire you from a distance. I want to build something alongside you for as long as you will let me." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, exhaustion and relief and something warmer still all tangled together in her chest. "I told you once that I did not need your name to build my life, Clyde Underwood, and I meant it. I still mean it. I have built a life of my own, out of my own choices and my own stubbornness, and I do not regret a single hard mile of that road." "I know," Clyde said softly. "But," Margaret continued, her voice growing thick with emotion she no longer wished to hide, "I find that I want your name anyway. Not because I need it to be someone, Clyde, but because I want to build the rest of my life with you standing beside me, as my equal, not my protector, not my rescuer, but my partner. If that is something you want as well." Clyde's answering smile was the brightest she had yet seen from him, and he did not hesitate before pulling her into his arms, right there on the bank of Sombra Crossing, in full view of the dispersing crowd, and kissing her soundly, without a trace of the careful restraint that had marked their earlier moments together. "Margaret Townsend," he said, when they finally broke apart, both of them laughing a little giddy with relief and love and the sheer improbable joy of having survived to reach this moment together. "I would be the proudest man in the Arizona Territory to give you my name, on whatever terms you wish to build a life with it. Married in the church in Prescott if you like, or before a judge if you would rather skip the fuss, or simply standing here at this crossing if that is what suits you best. I only know that I do not wish to spend another day of my life without you in it." "Here," Margaret said, looking around at the half-built bridge, at the wash where he had first caught her out of the air and refused to let her fall, at the place where everything between them had begun. "I think I would like it to be here, Clyde, once the bridge is finished properly. It seems only right, given how we started." 6 weeks later, on a mild spring afternoon with the last of the winter snow finally melted from the higher peaks, Margaret Townsend and Clyde Underwood stood together at the center of the newly completed bridge at Sombra Crossing, surrounded by friends from Prescott and Cañada Station, and the Bar U, while a circuit preacher who had traveled specially from Prescott spoke the words that made them husband and wife. Amos Whitfield stood proudly among the witnesses, having published, in the week since Renshaw's arrest by federal marshals on charges of debt peonage and bribery, a full accounting of the ironclad mine's corruption that had led to sweeping reforms across the territory's mining operations, along with a smaller, gentler piece announcing the upcoming wedding of the reporter who had broken the story. Otis Prout, safely returned from California, once word reached him that Renshaw had been arrested and could no longer threaten his safety, stood near the back of the gathered crowd, having sent word that he wished to see the conclusion of the story he had helped begin. The workers who had rebuilt the bridge, along with several of the former ironclad miners whose testimony had helped bring Renshaw's schemes into the light, mingled easily among the guests, a community that had, through danger and shared purpose, grown closer and stronger than it had been before. When the preacher pronounced them married, and Clyde kissed his bride there on the bridge where he had first caught her from a fall that should have killed her, Margaret felt no diminishment of the fierce independence that had carried her through every dangerous mile of her investigation. She was still herself, still Margaret Townsend, the journalist, still a woman who would go on chasing difficult truths wherever they led her. But she was also now something more than she had been before, not because Clyde's name had completed her, but because she had chosen, freely and with clear eyes, to build the rest of her life alongside a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "I told you I did not need your name," she murmured to him, as the gathered crowd began to applaud and call out their congratulations, the sound of it echoing warmly across the wash where wildflowers had already begun to push up through the melting snow along the banks. "You did tell me that," Clyde agreed, his arm warm and solid around her waist. "I gave it to you anyway." "I am glad you did," Margaret said, and meant every word of it, as she stood on the bridge that had once nearly taken her life and instead had given her, unexpectedly, everything that truly mattered, a partner who respected her strength, a community that had learned to stand together against corruption and fear, and a love built not on need but on the far sturdier foundation of two capable, stubborn hearts choosing each other, freely, over and over again. They rode back to the Bayou together that evening, Margaret in her wedding dress with Clyde's coat draped over her shoulders against the evening chill, the ranch house ahead of them lit warm and golden against the darkening sky, and Margaret thought that whatever stories still waited to be written, whatever dangers or discoveries the years ahead might hold, she had found in this stubborn, steady rancher and the wild, beautiful country he called home, the truest story of her life, one she intended to keep writing. With him for as long as they both should live.